November 19th, 1959. 8:12 p.m. Wells Restaurant, Harlem. The air in Wells was thick with the scent of fried chicken, collard greens, and ambition. It was Bumpy Johnson's air, the atmosphere he curated and controlled. From his regular booth in the back, upholstered in worn red leather, he presided over his kingdom. The clatter of silverware on plates, the low hum of conversation, the distant wail of a saxophone from a nearby club, it was all the symphony of his Harlem, a world he had bent to his will. He was 54 years old, but his eyes, deep-set and perpetually shadowed, held the weary authority of a man who had been old for a very long time. His suit was charcoal gray, impeccably tailored, the knot of his silk tie a perfect, unyielding dimple. Power, for Bumpy, was in the details. Beside him, Junie Bird, his most trusted lieutenant, sat with the quiet stillness of a coiled snake. Junie saw everything, said little, and understood the nuances of his boss's silence better than any man alive. He was stirring sugar into Bumpy's coffee, the silver spoon making a soft, rhythmic scrape against the ceramic. "The numbers from the Apollo district are up 7%, Junie said, his voice a low rumble. "Philly Black is holding his end. No trouble." Bumpy nodded, his gaze fixed on the street outside, where the neon lights of Harlem painted the wet asphalt in strokes of electric red and blue. He wasn't thinking about numbers. He was thinking about the delicate balance of his world, the invisible treaties and unspoken threats that kept the peace. He had built an empire on policy, narcotics, and fear, but he saw himself as something more, a guardian. He kept the Italian outfit south of 110th Street. He made sure the local businesses paid him for protection he actually provided, and he ensured that the institutions of Harlem, its churches, its clubs, its artists, were insulated from the worst of the outside world. They were his jewels, the proof that his grim work had a higher purpose. And no jewel shone brighter than Sammy Davis Jr. The kid was a supernova, a whirlwind of talent who could sing, dance, act, and charm the paint off a wall. He was one of them, a Harlem boy in spirit if not by birth, who had broken through the concrete ceiling of American prejudice to become a star. Bumpy felt a paternal, almost regal pride in Sammy's success. It was a victory for all of them. That's why the ringing of the payphone near the kitchen felt like a fire alarm. A waiter, his face pale, hurried over to their booth. "Mr. Johnson, it's for you. Urgent." Bumpy didn't move. He simply lifted his chin a fraction of an inch, a silent command for Junie. Junie rose, walked to the phone, listened for less than a minute, and hung up. When he returned to the table, the coiled stillness was gone. He was vibrating with a tension that made the air around him crackle. "What is it?" Bumpy's voice was flat, devoid of emotion. Junie leaned in close, his voice barely a whisper. "It's about Sammy. The kid. Frank's people are saying he's gone." "Gone where?" "Gone. Vanished. He was supposed to be at the Copa tonight. Never showed. His people are frantic. Word on the street, the downtown boys grabbed him. The Italians." Bumpy's hand, which had been resting on the table, closed into a fist so tight the knuckles went white. The symphony of the restaurant faded into a dull roar in his ears. The Italians had rules. They had agreements. They didn't cross the line. This was more than a line. It was a chasm. Why? The word was cold, hard, a piece of chipped flint. Junie swallowed, his eyes darting around the room. "The girl. The actress. Maybrit. She's white, Bumpy. They're engaged to be married. The bosses downtown, they don't like it. They see it as an insult. Sam Giancana, Tony Accardo, they see Sammy as their boy, their property. And he's disrespecting them by marrying a white woman." The logic was so twisted, so steeped in the venom of possession and race, that it took Bumpy a moment to process. They didn't see a star. They saw a racehorse they owned, and it had jumped the fence. He had spent his life fighting for a piece of the world, for the right to exist on his own terms. And here was the bluntest reminder that to them, a black man, no matter how famous, was never truly free. He was always on a leash. Bumpy pushed his plate away, the half-eaten chicken suddenly repulsive. He looked at Junie, and for the first time in years, Junie saw a fissure in the granite facade. It was a flicker of something raw, something terrifyingly vulnerable. It was the look of a king who had just realized his castle walls were made of sand. "Find out who," Bumpy said, his voice now a low, dangerous growl. Find out where. Use everyone. Turn this city upside down. I want him back. Now, witness testimony. Junius, Junie Bird. Recorded statement, 1988. I remember the way the glass sounded when it hit the wall. We were back at the office above the numbers spot on 126th Street. Bumpy, he never lost his cool. Not like that. Not ever. He'd get quiet, you know? The quieter he got, the more scared you should be. But this was different. He picked up this heavy crystal ashtray off his desk, looked at it for a second, and just hurled it against the brick. It didn't just shatter, it exploded. Like all the rage he'd been holding in for 30 years came out in that one moment. He started pacing. Back and forth, back and forth. Didn't say a word for 10 minutes. I just stood there, by the door, watching him. It was like watching a panther in a cage someone had just rattled. He was the most powerful black man in New York, maybe the country. He could make mayors tremble. He could stop a union strike with a phone call. But in that moment, he was powerless. Because this wasn't about money or territory. This was about hate. The pure, uncut, white-hot hate of men who believe they own the world and everyone in it. He finally stopped pacing and looked at me. His eyes were haunted. That's the only word for it. He said, "They think they can just take one of ours? Like he's a stray dog they can put down? In my city." He wasn't asking me. He was asking God, or the devil, or whoever was listening. It was the first time I understood that being the king of Harlem wasn't just a job to him. It was a burden. He was the shepherd, and the wolves had just snatched the most prized lamb from his flock. The guilt was eating him alive. He felt he had failed. And when Bumpy Johnson felt he had failed, the whole world had better brace for the storm. November 19th, 1959, 10:47 p.m. Office, 126th Street, Harlem. The office was a command center now. The phone rang incessantly. Men came and went, their faces grim, whispering reports from the Bronx, from Brooklyn, from the docks in Jersey. Bumpy stood before a large map of the New York metropolitan area, his hands clasped behind his back. He was no longer the restaurateur. He was the general. "Anything from Little Italy?" he asked, his voice sharp. "Quiet," said a man named Silk, a wiry numbers runner with ears everywhere. "Too quiet. The social clubs are buttoned up tight. No one's talking. They're hiding him," Bumpy murmured, more to himself than to anyone else. "They're enjoying this." Making a point, he tapped a finger on the map, on a section of warehouses near the Gowanus Canal in Brooklyn. "That's mob territory. Old places. Forgotten places. Places where a man can scream and no one hears." A frantic energy pulsed through the room. Every minute that passed was another minute Sammy was in their hands. Bumpy imagined the fear, the humiliation. Sammy was a performer, a man who lived in the spotlight. To be dragged into the shadows, into a place of brutal, anonymous violence, it was a special kind of cruelty. The phone rang again. Junie answered it, listened, and his face went slack with horror. He held the receiver out to Bumpy. "It's a reporter. From the Daily News. He says he got a tip." Bumpy took the phone, his knuckles white. "Johnson." The voice on the other end was reedy and excited. The voice of a man who smelled a career-making story. "Mr. Johnson?" "Al Pasternak, Daily News. I got an anonymous call. Said a source saw some wise guys dumping a body in the East River. A small man. Black. Wearing a tuxedo." The air rushed out of Bumpy's lungs. A cold dread, colder than any fear he had ever known for his own life, seized him. A tuxedo. It was what Sammy would have been wearing for his show. For a split second, the image flashed in his mind. Sammy's vibrant, electric body, now lifeless, sinking into the black, polluted water. The waste. The sheer, goddamned waste of it all. He couldn't breathe. The room tilted, the voices of his men blurring into a meaningless drone. He felt a hand on his arm. It was Junie. "Bumpy?" "Boss." Bumpy leaned against the desk, the phone still pressed to his ear, though he wasn't hearing anything anymore. He was seeing the headline, "Rat Pack Star Murdered." He was seeing the grief on the faces in Harlem. He was seeing his own failure, magnified 1,000 times. He had let the wolves in. "Get a car." Bumpy rasped into the phone, his voice a ghost of its usual command. "Tell me the location." "Now." He slammed the phone down. "Junie, get everyone. We're going to the river." The drive downtown was a frantic, silent blur. The city lights smeared past the windows of the Cadillac, a dizzying kaleidoscope of meaninglessness. Bumpy stared straight ahead, his mind a maelstrom of regret and fury. He had built his life on a code of strength, on the principle that he could protect his own. If Sammy was dead, that code was a lie. His entire life was a lie. They arrived at the pier mentioned by the reporter. The area was desolate, smelling of brine and decay. Police cars were already there, their lights flashing silently, casting long, dancing shadows on the warehouse walls. Bumpy and his men got out, their presence creating a ripple of tension among the uniformed cops. A grizzled police detective approached them, his hand resting near his holstered pistol. "This is a police scene, Bumpy. You need to leave." "The body," Bumpy said, his voice flat. "Who is it?" The detective chewed on his lip, sizing him up. He knew who Bumpy was. He knew what he was capable of. "It's no one you know. A local bookie. Weighed down. Mob hit, looks like. Definitely not your boy, Davis. Now, I'm asking you nice. Get out of here." Relief washed over Bumpy so intensely it almost buckled his knees. It felt like surfacing after being held underwater for too long. He was gasping, his heart hammering against his ribs. Sammy was still alive. The false alarm, the gut-wrenching horror of the last hour, had sharpened his desperation into a razor's edge. There would be no more waiting, no more strategy, only force. He turned to Junie, his eyes burning with a renewed, cold fire. "They're playing with us," he said, his voice low and lethal. "They wanted us to hear that. They wanted us to feel that. They want me to know they can do it any time they want." He got back into the car. "We're no longer asking," he announced to the men crowded around. "We're taking. Find me the man in charge of this insult. Find me Carlo Gambino. Find me Tommy Lucchese. Find me whoever gave this order. We're going to have a conversation. And we're not leaving until I get my answer." The hunt was no longer a search. It was an invasion. November 20th, 1959. 3:18 a.m. Unmarked warehouse, Red Hook, Brooklyn. The information came from a terrified capo in the Lucchese family, a man whose gambling debts Bumpy secretly owned. After a visit from Junie Bird and two of Bumpy's heaviest hitters, the man had sung like a canary. The location was a derelict fish packing plant in Red Hook, a place that hadn't seen an honest day's work in a decade. It was a tomb. Bumpy's motorcade of 3 black Cadillacs rolled up to the warehouse without headlights, silent as ghosts. The building loomed against the pre-dawn sky, a skeletal silhouette of rotting wood and broken windows. The only light came from a single, bare bulb hanging inside the main loading bay. Bumpy got out of the car, flanked by Junie and a dozen of his best men, all armed, all silent. He didn't want a war, not yet. He wanted a parley, but on his terms. He was walking into the lion's den, but he was bringing his own pride. The massive steel door creaked open, and a man stepped out. He was short, stout, with a face like a bulldog and eyes as cold as a morgue slab. This was Frankie Carbo, a notorious mob enforcer, a killer known as Mr. Gray. He wasn't the top boss, but he was the one they sent when they wanted a message delivered with a fist. "Bumpy," Carbo grunted, a cigarillo clenched in his teeth. "You're a long way from home." "I'm here for my property," Bumpy said, his voice calm, but carrying over the damp night air with chilling clarity. "You have something that belongs to Harlem. I want it back." Carbo laughed, a humorless, guttural sound. "He ain't your property. He's ours. He works in our clubs, he makes us money. And he's forgotten his place." Needed a reminder. Behind Carbo, inside the cavernous warehouse, Bumpy could see him. Sammy. He was tied to a wooden chair in the center of the concrete floor. His face was swollen and bruised, one eye puffed shut. His sharp tuxedo was torn and stained. But he was alive. His chest rose and fell in shallow, ragged breaths. He looked up as Bumpy entered, and in his one good eye, Bumpy saw a universe of terror and a flicker of desperate hope. The stench in the warehouse was overwhelming, a foul mix of old fish, mildew, and stale fear. Water dripped from the rusted ceiling, each drop echoing like a tick of a clock. For other mobsters stood in the shadows, their hands in their pockets, their postures radiating smug, violent confidence. Bumpy ignored them. He walked slowly, deliberately, toward the center of the room, his eyes locked on Carbo. His men fanned out behind him, a silent, menacing wall. "This is a mistake, Frankie," Bumpy said, his voice still unervingly level. A deep and profound mistake. You think this is about a girl? A wedding? You think you're teaching a lesson? You're not. You're lighting a match. Is that a threat? Carbo sneered, taking a step forward. It is a promise, Bumpy replied, stopping just a few feet from him. That boy there, he gestured with his chin towards Sammy, is more than a singer. He's a symbol. He is the dream of every kid on my streets. You put your hands on him, you are putting your hands on all of them. You are spitting in the face of every single person in Harlem. And for that, there is no negotiation. Bumpy let the silence hang in the air. He could feel the weight of his men behind him, the itchy trigger fingers, the simmering rage. He held it all in check with his own iron will. Let's be clear about what happens next, Bumpy continued, his voice dropping to a conspiratorial whisper. Option 1. You untie him. You let him walk out of here with me, and we forget this night ever happened. I will swallow my pride. You will swallow yours. And we go back to making money. Option 2. You don't. And starting tomorrow morning, not one of your numbers runners will make it to the end of his block. Not one of your shipments will make it off the docks. Not one of your restaurants south of Central Park will serve a meal without a firebomb coming through the window. I will burn your city to the ground. And I will do it smiling. Carbo stared at him, his bulldog face unreadable. He was calculating the odds, the cost of a full-scale war with the undisputed king of Harlem. Bumpy had the numbers, the loyalty, and a righteous fury that Carbo's men, motivated only by greed, could never match. He's just a nigger singer, one of the goons in the corner muttered. Before the last word was out of his mouth, Junie Bird had crossed the space and slammed the butt of his pistol into the man's temple. The man crumpled to the floor without a sound. The other mobsters flinched, their hands emerging from their pockets. Bumpy didn't even turn his head. His eyes remained fixed on Carbo. The price just went up, he said softly. Untie him. Now, for a long, tense moment, nobody moved. The only sound was the drip, drip, drip from the ceiling and Sammy's labored breathing. Then, Carbo gave a slight, almost imperceptible nod. Two of his men moved forward, their bravado gone, and began to cut the ropes that bound Sammy to the chair. When he was free, Sammy tried to stand, but his legs gave way. Junie and another of Bumpy's men were there instantly, catching him, holding him up. Bumpy walked over to him, his face a mask of cold fury and deep, aching sorrow. He reached out and gently touched Sammy's bruised cheek. It's over, son, he whispered. I got you. Sammy tried to speak, but only a choked sob came out. Tears streamed from his good eye, cutting a clean path through the grime on his face. Bumpy turned and walked back to Carbo. This never happened, he said. But if a single hair on his head is ever harmed again by anyone in your organization, I will hold you personally responsible. And you know my reach. Without waiting for a reply, Bumpy turned and walked out of the warehouse, his men forming a protective circle around the broken, weeping form of Sammy Davis Jr. as they stepped out into the cold, damp air of the approaching dawn. It felt like they were emerging from the gates of hell itself. November 20th, 1959, 5:45 a.m. Safe House, Sugar Hill, Harlem. The apartment was one of Bumpy's secret places, a high-floor sanctuary with a sprawling view of the city that now seemed so hostile. It was furnished with quiet elegance, thick carpets, heavy drapes, polished mahogany. A private doctor, a man who owed Bumpy his life and career, was already waiting. They laid Sammy down on a large sofa. He was shivering, not from the cold, but from shock and trauma. The doctor, a man named Charles Covington, worked quickly and quietly, cleaning the cuts, checking for broken bones. He diagnosed a cracked rib, a mild concussion, and severe bruising. But the deepest wounds weren't visible. He'll be physically fine in a week or two, Dr. Covington said to Bumpy in the next room, his voice low. But his spirit, that's another matter. They did more than beat him. They tried to break him. Bumpy nodded grimly. He understood. They hadn't just attacked Sammy's body. They had attacked his essence, his joy, his right to exist and to love. For the next 3 days, Bumpy Johnson did not leave that apartment. He canceled all his meetings, ignored all his business. He sat in a chair in the corner of the living room, a silent, unmovable sentinel, while Sammy drifted in and out of a fitful, nightmare-plagued sleep. This wasn't a drug withdrawal, but it was its own kind of hell. It was the withdrawal from safety, from dignity. Sammy would wake up screaming, his arms flailing as if to ward off invisible blows. He would cry out in his sleep, whimpering names and pleas. During his waking hours, he was a ghost, staring blankly at the wall, the vibrant light in his eyes extinguished. He barely ate, barely spoke. Bumpy had seen men break before. He'd broken men himself. But this was different. This was the desecration of something beautiful. On the second day, Sammy woke up with a quiet clarity. He looked over at Bumpy, his one open eye focusing on him for the first time. Why? Sammy's voice was a dry, cracked whisper. Because of May? Bumpy nodded slowly. They're small men, Sammy. With small minds. They can't stand to see a man like you fly. Especially not with a woman they think belongs to them. They called me. Sammy's voice broke, and he couldn't finish the sentence. He didn't have to. Bumpy had heard that word his entire life. It was the bludgeon they used when their other weapons failed. I know what they called you, Bumpy said, his voice soft but laced with steel. It's the only word they have when they're faced with something they can't understand and can't control. It's a word of fear. Their fear, not your shame. He got up and walked over to the sofa. He poured a glass of water and held it to Sammy's lips. You're going to get through this. You're going to rest. And then you're going to go marry that girl. And you're going to be bigger and brighter than ever before. You're going to shine so bright it burns their eyes out. That will be your revenge. Sammy looked at him, and a single tear rolled down his cheek. It wasn't a tear of pain, but of something else. Gratitude. Understanding. Bumpy arranged everything. He had Sammy secretly moved from the apartment and driven to the airport, where a private plane was waiting. He was flying to Las Vegas, where Frank Sinatra, furious and protective, would watch over him. From there, he would go to London to marry May Britt, far from the reach of the New York mob. The solution wasn't rehab, it was escape. It was the freedom to live. As Bumpy watched the car carrying Sammy pull away from the curb, he felt a profound sense of exhaustion. He had won the battle, but he knew, with a chilling certainty, that he had started a war. And the bill for that war would eventually come due. Witness testimony, Junius, Junie Bird. Recorded statement, 1988. After Sammy was safe, things got quiet for a while. Too quiet. We all knew what was coming. Bumpy had stared down the entire commission. He'd made them look weak in their own backyard. That's not something they forgive. Ever. They couldn't touch him on the street. Bumpy had Harlem locked down too tight. So they went another way. They went legal. They had been trying to get him on a big narcotics charge for years. Suddenly, all these federal agents who couldn't find their own asses with a map started getting anonymous tips. Witnesses who'd been silent for a decade suddenly remembered everything. It was a setup, plain and simple. The mob was feeding the feds everything they needed to put him away. It was cleaner than a bullet and, for them, much more satisfying. To see the great Bumpy Johnson caged by their system. The trial was a joke. He was convicted before he even walked into the courtroom. They gave him 15 years. Sent him to the worst place they could think of, Alcatraz. The Rock. A cold, wet hell in the middle of San Francisco Bay. They weren't just jailing him. They were trying to erase him. I was the one who handled his affairs on the outside. And I was the one who sent him the packages. He didn't want money or contraband. He wanted news. Specifically, news about Sammy. So every month, I'd cut out the articles from Variety, from the Amsterdam News, from Life magazine. I sent him pictures of Sammy and May Britt on their wedding day. Pictures of their daughter, Tracy, when she was born. Clippings of his sold-out shows at the Sands. His command performance for the Queen of England. Bumpy would write back. Not often. The letters were short. He'd ask about my family. He'd tell me to make sure the church on 135th got its donation every Christmas. And at the end of almost every letter, he'd write the same thing. Glad to see the kid is doing well. Tell him to keep shining. He was in that cell, in the middle of nowhere, cold and alone. But he was watching. He was watching this star that he'd saved from being extinguished, and he was watching it burn brighter and brighter. I think it was what kept him going. It was his proof. Proof that he had done something that mattered. He'd lost his kingdom, his freedom, his life, really. But he had saved one of his jewels. And for him, that was a kind of victory. July 12, 1968. J. and L. Restaurant, 143rd and Lenox, Harlem. The Harlem Bumpy Johnson returned to was not the one he had left. It was a decade later, and the world had spun on without him. The neighborhood was angrier, louder, more desperate. The civil rights movement had morphed into Black Power. The music was different, the clothes were different, the very air felt charged with a new, volatile energy. Bumpy was 63 years old now, released from prison, a shadow of his former self. His power on the streets had evaporated, his empire carved up by younger, more ruthless players. He was a relic, a living legend that most of the new generation had only heard stories about. He spent his days in a small apartment, reading poetry and playing chess, a quiet, forgotten king in a kingdom that no longer recognized him. He was sitting in a booth at a small soul food spot, a place that reminded him a little of the old Wells, when Junie Bird slid in across from him. Junie was older too, his hair graying at the temples, but his loyalty was as unwavering as ever. He was Bumpy's last link to the man he used to be. "Got a visitor for you, Bumpy," Junie said, a strange look on his face. "Someone from out of town." Bumpy just grunted, stirring his coffee. He had few visitors these days. The bell above the restaurant door jingled. Bumpy didn't look up. He heard the footsteps approach the table, expensive shoes on a linoleum floor. He heard Junie get up quietly and move to a nearby table, giving them space. "Mr. Johnson." The voice was unmistakable. Smooth, confident, seasoned by thousands of performances, but underneath it, a tremor of something else. Respect. Deference. Bumpy looked up slowly. Standing there was Sammy Davis Jr. He wasn't a kid anymore. He was a man in his early 40s, a global superstar at the absolute peak of his fame. He was dressed in a tailored suit that probably cost more than the entire restaurant, a diamond pinky ring catching the fluorescent light. He looked like he owned the world, but his eyes, as they met Bumpy's, were the same as they had been in that cold, dark warehouse. They held the memory of fear and the overwhelming weight of gratitude. "Sammy," Bumpy said, his voice raspy. He gestured to the seat across from him. "Sit down." Sammy sat, looking awkward and out of place, a king from another kingdom paying tribute. For a moment, neither of them spoke. The clatter of the restaurant seemed to fade away. "I heard you were home," Sammy said finally. "I was in town for a show. I had to come see you." "You look good, kid," Bumpy said, and he meant it. "The world's been good to you." "The world has been what it is," Sammy replied, his voice soft. "You're the one who was good to me. I never got to thank you. Not properly. There's nothing to thank me for. You were one of ours. You were in trouble. That's the end of the story." Sammy shook his head, a sad smile playing on his lips. "No, that was the beginning of the story. The beginning of my real life. Everything I have, my wife, my kids, my career, I have it because of what you did that night. They would have killed me, Bumpy. I saw it in their eyes. They would have killed me and thrown me in the river, and the world would have just kept on turning." He reached into his jacket and pulled out a checkbook. "I know you don't need anything, but I want to, I don't know, set you up. Whatever you want. A house, a business. Just say the word." Bumpy looked at the checkbook, then back at Sammy's earnest, pleading face. He slowly pushed it back across the table with one finger. "I don't want your money, son." "Then what? What can I do?" Bumpy leaned forward, his old eyes, the ones that had seen everything, locking onto Sammy's. "You're already doing it," he said, his voice a low, powerful whisper. "You keep shining. You keep flying so high that those little men on the ground can't even see you anymore. You live your life. You love your family, and you remember that your talent is a gift. You don't owe it to them. You owe it to us, to the people in this neighborhood who look at you and see what's possible." He leaned back, the effort of the speech seeming to tire him. "That's all the payment I'll ever need. Just knowing you're all right." Tears welled in Sammy's eyes. He nodded, unable to speak. He reached across the table and put his hand on Bumpy's weathered, arthritic one. It was a small gesture, but it bridged the gap of a decade, of a prison sentence, of two vastly different worlds. It was a touch that acknowledged a debt that could never truly be repaid. "All right, Mr. Johnson," Sammy whispered, his voice thick with emotion. "All right." He stayed for another 10 minutes, talking about his children, about his plans for a new album. When he finally stood to leave, he looked down at the old, broken king sitting in the cheap booth. "You're a good man, Bumpy Johnson," he said. Bumpy just gave a slight nod. "You take care of yourself, kid." He watched Sammy walk out the door, back to his world of spotlights and applause. He He sat there for a long time, staring into his cold coffee. He had lost his empire. He had lost his youth and his health. But sitting there, in the fading light of a Harlem afternoon, Ellsworth, Bumpy Johnson felt like the richest man in the world. He had protected his own. He had saved the music. The legacy was secure.